So I'm delighted to be chairing tonight's event, which is entitled, Yes, Humans and Other Animals, the Tangled Web of Culture. Yes. Does anyone actually know what that means? Because I'm not sure I do. But thankfully we have three very distinguished speakers tonight who I think are going to help. So Andy Whiten is Professor of Psychology at University of St Andrews, and he is going to help us navigate this territory by introducing chimpanzees to us and taking us into chimp culture, the culture of our closest living relative. Professor Ruth Mace is an evolutionary anthropologist at UCL, and she is going to take a look at human cultures and in particular explore the ways in which environment and genes may influence culture, the ways in which that is possible to detect. And we have Guy Vince, who's a science journalist and broadcaster and author of this terrific book, Adventures in the Anthropocene, and she is going to tell us about her travels around the world, exploring the ways in which humans have influenced or are influencing planet Earth, and the very ingenious ways in which ordinary people are coping and finding ways to navigate the difficult consequences of this human-changed planet. So we're going to have questions after the three speakers have spoken, so save them all up for then, and hopefully we'll have around half an hour of questions towards the end. Now, over the last 50 years, we've come an extraordinarily long way our attitudes towards animals have changed a huge amount. And so that space that I was talking about between the animal kingdom and then humans has become blurred and is constantly changing. It's never very easy to study animals, and particularly if you're trying to find out about how they're feeling about something, or their emotions, or their culture. But with sensitivity and patience and some imagination, it is possible to frame certain questions that allow us to get an insight into the culture of non-human animals. Now, our first speaker tonight is a renowned expert in this field, and so without further ado, hand over to Andy Whiten. Round of applause, please.
Good evening. Yes, my brief was to talk about the cultures of apes and other animals, but we've each only got 15 or 20 minutes, so I've decided really to focus on our closest living relative, chimpanzees, because I think they illustrate many of the ways in which we think we can talk about culture in animals, and in fact, in several ways really, their culture is the most complex among non-human animals. So I thought I should start off with a question which we all need to address. What is culture? Well, if you go out and buy a Sunday newspapers, one in particular, I think you'll get a whole section, one of many, which is called culture. And what's that about? Well, that tends to be about the arts, about the cinema, about what we might call high culture, ballet and opera and so on. But when anthropologists, I think like Ruth Mace here, or psychologists like myself talk about culture, we're meaning something much broader than that. The definition I'm offering today, I think, covers what we think of as characteristics of human culture, like this, that Ruth's going to talk about more, that vary around the globe. So the ways in which we dress, the kind of customs we indulge in, like this procession here, the kind of things we eat, and the way we eat them, the way we cook them and so on, our languages, and our material culture, our tools and weapons and so on, like the bow and arrow up there, and of course all the digital technology that's surrounding us and operating in our culture right now. So what ties those together, I think, is something like this. That these are all the things that we learn from others. We call this social learning, learning from others, but that endure for long enough to create socially transmitted traditions. So these are behaviours that spread by some process of social learning from others. They may spread across a population and indeed across populations, and then we start to call these traditions, or perhaps multiple traditions, we call those cultures. So I hope Ruth would sign up to this definition. We'll see. This is one I'm going to use, so I've illustrated it so far with humans. When we turn to chimpanzees, well, 15 years ago now, I was privileged to be the first author of this paper, which collated all we knew at that stage about chimpanzee behaviour across Africa. And it's an amazing fact to think that Henry just mentioned a time frame of 50 years, and how much our notions of animals have changed in that time. Well, just 50 years ago, certainly 60 years ago, we knew next to nothing still about our closest living relative and how those relatives lived in the wild. And that's a very short time since then, when you think of casting that against the whole of human history, or indeed the millions of years in which the two species have been evolving together on the planet. Well, that all began to change when Jane Goodall went to Gombe and started studying chimpanzees there. Japanese soon followed. So by the time we were putting this story together in 1999, we had a total across all these different sites of about 150 years of observations of chimpanzees. And what had begun to emerge was that chimpanzees behave in different ways across Africa, as of course do people. And there was circumstantial evidence suggesting, well, this is because, for the same reason really, because these are traditions and cultures. The way we approached this was to collate all the information from all the long-term study sites, and the authors that I put up here, the authors of the paper, were all the leaders of these long-term research study sites, Jane Goodall and others. And what we did was a two-phase systematic study, putting together all the information then. We first of all asked each research group to suggest what they thought might be cultural variations, putative cultures if you like, behaviours that were very common at the site they worked at, and they'd heard, well, they don't happen elsewhere, or the other way around, you know, they're common elsewhere. In 30 years of studying these chimpanzees, I've never seen them. And that gave us a list of 65 candidate behaviour patterns that we thought might be cultural, and then we gave that list back to each of the research groups and asked them to code them. For each of the longest term study sites, the 6 longest term ones I'm summarising here, were these customary, that's pretty much everybody did them at your site, or at least what we call habitual, done repeatedly by several chimpanzees, with circumstantial evidence that these might therefore be socially learned and passed on. Or at the other end of the scale, are they in fact absent? And there, of course, it's really critical to think, well, is that with some obvious environmental explanation for that, which wouldn't be very interesting, or not. So if we're looking at a behaviour like you see at the top right there, those chimpanzees using large stones to crack nuts open, which happens in West Africa. When we find it doesn't happen in East Africa, well, if there aren't the nuts there or the raw materials, well, that's not very interesting. But we find that, in fact, there are the materials elsewhere in Africa, and no chimpanzee seems to have discovered it. It's just a behaviour that is found across about 700 kilometres of far West Africa. So that allowed us then to isolate from this 65, 39 behaviours that met our criteria. They were very common at one site, customary or habitual, and yet they were absent at least one other site, without any environmental or genetic explanation, so far as we can see. And this picture here shows 6 panels. It's the same 39 possibilities there, and they're lit up, as it were, they're coloured if they're common at a local site. So those patchwork quilts express the local array of traditions. You can't read those probably very well, even now. Perhaps the people at the back can't read those, and I can't describe all of them now. One important thing is that they cover the whole range of chimpanzee behaviour, really. So things like food processing, how you actually peel complicated foods and get into the middle, all kinds of tool use for foraging, for dealing with food, but also for hygiene, for comfort, and so on, and various aspects of social behaviour, even grooming techniques. So if you're a chimpanzee in West Africa and you groom an ectoparasite off the chimpanzee you're grooming, how do you dispatch it? You put it on your forearm and you squash it, and that's it. But if you're in East Africa, you'll probably take that parasite and you pick a leaf and you put it on the leaf and inspect it on the leaf, and then you'll use the leaf to squash it. So differences even at that level and other aspects of courtship gambits. Well, as I say, I don't have time to illustrate all of these. I'm just going to have time to illustrate one. I'm just going to pick out one or two really. The first one is top left there. It's called pestle pounding, and it's only found in Bossou in Guinea. And what happens here is a chimpanzee climbs into the top of the palm tree. Quite a tricky thing to do. And then when it's there, it picks up one of the large fronds that the last chimps have probably left. And having got what it can from the growing point of the palm tree manually, it then uses that tool to beat into that and create a kind of mush or soup. That's what it's doing on the left here. And then it reaches down and picks it out. So here's a chimpanzee, you see a better view here now. Extraordinary behaviour, standing bipedally like this, and with a lot of directed force beating into that central point. And this is very strange behaviour. We don't see it elsewhere in Africa, and yet here, so everybody does it. That's the local custom to get your food, and that takes you through the dry season. Here's another behaviour also seen here, nut cracking using wooden hammers. The one on the left here is a stone hammer used for a very hard fruit, and this illustrates how it's quite tricky, and you shouldn't perhaps try it in a tree. And in fact, it takes several years to perfect. Youngsters will take up to 8, 9, or even 10 years to really get this right. You can't just smash a nut and knock it into smithereens, because then you end up with a powder. You've got to crack the shell and then be able to get the nut out. Now that is slightly more widespread across West Africa. It happens at both those two places, Bossou and the Thai forest, and as I say, it's spread about 700 kilometres, but it stops at a large river cutting through West Africa. It goes up to one side and then over the other side. It's not happening, although scientists have been there and checked. The raw materials are there, the nuts are there. I can crack nuts. No chimpanzee has thought of doing it, apparently. So what this leads us to is a picture which I can summarise as illustrating multiple, very diverse traditions. As I said, the whole range of chimpanzee behaviour. Let's just put that list to remind ourselves there. But also a second conclusion. If you look at these panels and think of them as a patchwork quilt, you can probably see that each one is distinct. It's unique. What that means is that if I watch a chimpanzee for long enough and tick off sometimes just 2 or 3 behaviours, I can tell you where this chimpanzee comes from on the basis of its cultural profile alone. So that's a bit like with the human, you see, well, I don't know, they're eating food with chopsticks, they speak in a certain way, dress in a certain way, and so on. Well, you can perhaps identify ultimately, where they're likely to have come from because of that array of local traditions. So, for chimpanzees, have these unique arrays of traditions. At least that's what we're concluding on the basis of this really observational, circumstantial evidence that we can gather by watching chimpanzees across Africa. Now, scientists, what we really like to do to kind of clinch this and really test this idea is to perhaps do an experiment. Why? Well, because perhaps although we're saying, let's take that example of pestle pounding, we can't see any environmental or genetic explanation why it's happening in one place very commonly and not elsewhere. Perhaps there's just something about those palm trees we've not been able to detect. Doing an experiment is a very scientifically powerful way of proceeding. So we took a chimpanzee from there and, as it were, parachuted it into East Africa, and then asked, well, does the behaviour spread? And it did. Well, then we know for sure. But there's obviously ethical reasons why we can't do that, and indeed practical reasons why it's very difficult to do some migration experiment like that. So what we've done is a whole series of experiments with captive chimpanzees in large enclosures to deal with this question. Are these really socially learned traditions? Can chimpanzees sustain traditions by this process of social learning? Well, here's how we did this. We took 2 groups of chimpanzees, they're the circles here, and we presented them both with the same kind of naturalistic problem, like they get in the wild, where they can't get a piece of food, like this grape, the one on the right here, this grape here stuck behind a blockage, and they can't get it out. Well, they can with a stick tool. We take one chimpanzee out for a little while and show that high-ranking adult female that you can use your stick to lift the blockage up out of the way, and then the grape will roll down and she'll get it. So we teach her that way of doing it. But there's a second way, which is to open a hatch here, poke the stick in, knock the blockage back, and kick the grape off the back, and then it will roll down under the bottom pipe of pan pipes, and the chimpanzee gets it. So we ended up there with two experts who can solve this problem, but in two very different ways. And then we reunite that chimpanzee with the rest of her group, and this is what we call an open diffusion experiment. So we're asking, well, will others come and watch? Will they learn? Will the behaviour spread differently or differentially in the two groups, these two methods? And what we found was that it did. But right before I actually show you the results of that, I'm going to, having introduced that idea, show you just one more experiment which takes this to a new level and asks, well, could chimpanzee behaviours actually spread by this process from group to group, which is what it would have to have done if say, that nutcracker could spread across so much of West Africa. So here again we have two ways of solving the same problem, getting food out of that box there by opening a hatch at the top and stabbing the stick in and pulling the food out, or instead opening a little lifting a little hatch at the side, sliding a different tool in and pushing the food out of that tunnel. And we introduced one at point one, there's group B1, just to one chimpanzee, same idea as before. And we introduced the other technique just to one chimpanzee at position 1 in group B4. And these three groups at the top can see each other through big windows at the side, and the three at the bottom can also see their neighbours through big windows, but each triplet can't see the other triplet. So what happened? Well, here's a graph illustrating what happened. Here's colour-coded one chimpanzee doing one method, that method there, and here's colour coding showing that one chimpanzee doing the other method, the lift method. So what happens as that might spread across the group? Yes, these behaviours spread differently, and that's already showing that yes, these chimpanzees can transmit this behaviour across the group like they did with the pan pipes. But you'll notice there's one chimp here, who's the black sheep, as it were, who realised, well, you could do this the other way. Once they've seen all the others doing it one way, they get the idea we can solve this, and they work it out the other way. And that's this stabbing way, which you might think, if you know anything about chimpanzees, as maybe a more natural kind of thing for chimpanzees to do. So by the time we've seen, well, what happens as chimpanzees across these three groups manage to solve this problem, they'll all end up doing it that way. But in fact, that wasn't what's happened. If we play the whole sequence, we find that what's spread across this triplet of groups here is that same behaviour that we introduced right at the start, that we seeded. It's spread right across the three groups, and in fact, that's all that these are doing. So they've even kind of risen over, you might say, the little corruptions that happen along the way, with some chimpanzees working out you could do it a different way. There's something strong enough about their cultural processes. So there's the same information shown in a different way, and I put that graph up just to show that we did it with other devices like that, and we got the same kind of pattern if you look at the blue compared to the green. And then in another place called the Yerkes Centre, we're doing it with several other devices, and the second one down there, called pan pipes, that's the experiment I illustrated earlier on. So what have we got there? We've got one chimpanzee who was trained to do the poke behaviour. That spread right across the whole group. And here we introduced the different behaviour lift, and that spread across that group with a few corruptions here, again, with the poking behaviour being perhaps the more chimpy thing that surfaces anyway. So the point of this is that here we're showing that for sure these chimpanzees are socially learning these behaviours. They are traditions, and they're spreading multiple traditions, spreading across these groups, which, as it were, is consistent with our interpretation of what's happening in Africa. So that's the story about chimpanzee cultures, per se. And the question I'd like to just spend a few minutes finally talking about is the question, well, how is culture transmitted? How are these behaviours passed on? Well, as we see there, others come and watch very carefully what the expert's doing. And if you watch youngsters, oops, can we go back to that slide? If you watch youngsters, they watch very carefully what adults do. One of the experiments we did, which is avoiding that problem of the ethical and practical problems of moving one chimpanzee from one part of Africa to another, was to go to East Africa where there happens to be a community of chimpanzees on an island, and these are chimpanzees who are, as it were, casualties of the bushmeat trade. They were orphaned, and they end up in a refuge on an island in Lake Victoria. Of course, they don't know how to nut crack. But we thought there it was a safe and ethical thing to do, to get one chimpanzee nut cracking and then say, well, would the others learn from it? And what we found was that they did. Rather than show you lots of graphs about that, I'm just going to show you one video clip which illustrates, I think, something really important about the details of what happens here when this process is going on. Because, well, I tend to introduce this little interlude by talking about my father-in-law. He used to watch boxing on the TV, and he got really quite involved in it, and so he'd be watching, and then he'd start kind of doing this and sort of going with the flow. And we're such a cultural species, I think we just tend automatically to identify with others in that way, and can't help ourselves, as it were, as behaviour kind of spills over and a little sort of copy of what we're watching, because we have this amazing imitative tendency. And I think that's exactly what you're going to see here for just a few minutes. So if we run this, we'll see the one on the right who knows how to nut crack start to do it. But watch the little guy on the left. So he's just really identifying with what's happening there, and as well can't help himself but sort of start to mimic that. I think that's illustrating quite an important capacity in these chimps. The second experiment I'll talk about, this is my last little bit, is again with those chimpanzees actually in that sanctuary in Gamber Island. Now here, chimpanzees, we did the same thing with children. We're often comparing the two species in their cultural capacities. Here, we had a chimpanzee who was faced with this kind of problem. It's a big, what we call an artificial fruit. It's got food in the middle of it. The question is, how do you get it out? Well, you can use a stick tool again. What chimp sees, top right there, is a familiar caretaker come and take a stick tool, get rid of some sort of defences on the top, open a hole up, and then stab that stick in several times. Bang, 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 like that. Take it out, then bottom left there, open up another door there, up another hole, and then poke the stick in and pull out some food and share it with the chimp. Chimpanzees see that several times, a bit like they would watching an adult using a tool in the wild, and then it's their turn. Well, what would you do? What we would predict you would do is go through that whole routine. You don't quite understand it's an opaque kind of artificial fruit thing. You don't quite understand it works, but you've seen, well, that all works, so I'll do all that. We don't predict you would run through all that. And we predicted the same thing for children, of course. But there's a second condition of our experiment that some chimpanzees and some children were in, when the box was just the same, except it was totally transparent. Now here, when that tool goes in the top, you can see that it just beats on an artificial panel here. It can't actually be doing anything relevant to what later happens when the tool goes in here and pulls out the food. So what we thought is, if you're watching an intelligent imitator, they'll miss that out if that's the condition you're in. You see the transparent box, whereas if you see the opaque one, you probably run through the whole lot. And we were interested in the question of, well, we assume that we're the intelligent species, that's what children will do, they'll make that discrimination. Will the chimps, or are the chimps just kind of dumb ape? They just kind of mindlessly ape to the extent they ever do. Well, so what we're predicting here is we give them 3 goes, those first 3 there, and what we're predicting is they'll do the irrelevant action in the top, okay? But then as soon as they see the transparent one, what's labelled the clear box there, they switch to just doing the relevant one, they miss out the irrelevant one. So that's what we're predicting. Here's what we found with children. Oops. Yeah. Okay. This is a good sort of illustration. This is science in action. You make a prediction, you collect the data throw your hypotheses straight out the window, you were wrong. The children copied everything, including with the transparent box, with the white bubble when we saw this. It seems so obvious. It's staring you in the face that you don't need to do all that stuff at the top. But children, it seems, can't help themselves. They just copy the whole lot. Whereas the chimpanzees did what we predicted an intelligent copier would do. For the first 3, they didn't copy as much as the children, but they mostly copied the whole sequence with the opaque box. And then once they get the transparent one, they see, well, probably don't need to do that. I understand the causality here well enough to miss that out. So you can start to ask, well, we began to ask ourselves, well, which is the intelligent species here? But I think the answer is that no, it does make sense, actually, it must make sense. And perhaps the answer is basically we are such a cultural species that it's a good rule of thumb for children to simply copy, almost willy-nilly, in a kind of blanket fashion, everything an intelligent adult is intentionally doing, at least, which is what they saw here. And if experimenters sometimes play tricks on them, as we were doing here in a sense, well, you can always correct that later on. You live for several years and you've got time to correct things that you overcopy. Other researchers have come on behind us, cognitive developmentalists, child development experts, and they've started to call this over-imitation. And you can see the sense in which it is over-imitation, but perhaps it's a useful technique that our species has, and chimpanzees avoid it. So I think that's my last bit of a proper slide. Just to remind you, I asked what is culture here with my definition, which I hope is going to be acceptable to the speakers who follow me. And my answer to the question is, well, do other species have this? At least if we look at chimpanzees, I think there's a resounding yes to that question. But of course, there's a gulf. Chimpanzees don't have human culture. They don't have all this. They don't have things like this. They're still running around in Africa with no clothes on. And our species, indeed, is pretty much obliterating theirs. It's one of the sad result of this contrast between the cultural capacities of the two species. Here's some of the things I talked about just to remind you, and with that, I'm done.
To take us on and find out all about humans, human culture.
So, moving swiftly on, we shall go straight on to look at how human culture, to start with, might be a bit different from animal culture. In particular, I'm going to look at the ecological basis of culture as well. So can we kind of understand it in the same terms that we understand the evolution of perhaps animal behaviour, or is it different? Well, so humans are an unusual species because we actually live, absolutely everywhere in the world. And there's no other species that does that apart from our parasites and our pets and all this sort of thing. And it is our cultural capacity that's made us able to do this. And as Anne already explained, animals can do culture when you define it as socially transmitted behaviour. But humans do something really clever, which is called cumulative cultural evolution. So, and what this actually means is that not only can we learn from others, but we can sort of accumulate the knowledge and build on the shoulders of giants, if you like. So when I'm sitting here, I don't need to know how this little gizmo works or anything like that, because somebody else figured out. All the millions of years of ancestors and all the rest of it have come up with various sorts of behaviours, and humans are beginning to. The chimps can learn things, but they more or less have to go back to the beginning with each sort of new chimpanzee, as it were, and learn from scratch. Whereas I don't have to do that, you don't have to do that, so we can actually accumulate knowledge over generations, and that's extremely clever, if you like, way of doing culture. So, Andy gave you some examples of animal culture. I'll just give you some slightly more possibly useful cultural traits. Here are some not very useful cultural traits. These capuchins spend a lot of time sitting around sticking their fingers in each other's eyes, and there's lots of cultural variation in how you do that. You feel a bit sorry for a species that invented culture and wasted it on that. Perhaps my favourite are the dolphins. I don't know if you watch Spinal Pod on the BBC and this kind of thing, but they have got some really super, almost human-like things. So if dolphins find pufferfish, they get very excited, because if you harass a pufferfish, it releases toxins, and the dolphins harass the pupperfish, and then they all sit around and puff in the toxins. So, which sounds probably familiar. Or they wear sponges on their noses, and again, culturally transmitted. Certain mature lines will pick this up, and others won't. But dolphins, nonetheless, they're sort of stuck. So they're my sort of candidate for taking over the world, except for the fact that they live in the sea. They don't really have any arms or anything like that. So there's not much they can do, whereas humans do have this very clever trick whereby, so here's, someone invented rock art, and we've built on from that to have text and writing. someone invented how to make a stone tool, and we've built on from that to make motorized vehicles or whatever. And this is why we have basically spread all over the world. One of the things you need to do that is a high population density. So if you actually look at when something like rock art popped up in the archaeological record, it coincides it's present in some places 100, well, let's say 40,000 years ago, and not in others. And that matches pretty well with where human population density was high. So this is why we think it's culturally transmitted, because if you have sparse population density, low population density, you simply can't maintain these elaborate, exotic traditions where we're learning from each other. And if you want some evidence of that sort of working in the other direction, so the Tasmanians, which is an island south of Australia, we know that when the Tasmanians arrived in Tasmania, they had all the sorts of things that the mainland Aboriginal Australians had, and I've listed some of them there: bone tools, cold weather, gear, fishing, spears, all sorts of boomerangs, lots of kind of quite familiar technology found in Australian Aborigines. But because they became isolated by being on this island, when they were sort of encountered by seafaring, I guess it was 17th century explorers, as it were, they found them living in a Stone Age culture where they basically lost all those things because they just didn't have a large enough population to sustain it. And if you want to test it experimentally in the lab, it's also been done where if you give groups of people tasks which have to be transmitted culturally, small groups of people can't do it. They do nearly as well as large groups of people. So high population density is one of those things that sort of shows how important cultural transmission is in developing all these kind of rather exotic behaviours. So actually, humans have gone through a lot of, major transitions, which I would describe as essentially cultural in our social life. So hunter-gatherers came up with tools are expanded all over the world. When we invented farming, all sorts of things, our population massively grew, and we started having all this diversity in like our kinship systems, our political systems, all these kind of social arrangements all became extremely diverse all over the world. And then since then we've had urbanization, education, and all sorts of slightly weird things which are harder to explain in English terms, like the demographic transition to low fertility. Now I don't have time at all to talk about any of these. I'm just quickly going to give some examples about, can we understand sort of cultural diversity to some extent in an evolutionary sense as an adaptation to the environment in which we live? So I'm going to start with some examples, just sort of classics from anthropology to do with marriage and kinship systems. And then I'm also going to talk not just about how ecology influences our culture, but also how our own culture is influencing our genes. So in other words, genes and culture are co-evolving, so gene culture, co-evolution. And I'll just quickly give you some examples and we can maybe discuss more later on. So marriage, I said we talk about marriage systems. So humans, in some parts of the world, there's monogamous couples. Other parts of the world, a man might be allowed to marry several women, and there's even a few parts of the world where several women might marry one man. And this graph actually relates that to sort of male labour and environment. So let me just give you some examples. So in Africa, for example, African pastoralists who keep big herds of livestock, their polygyny is quite common. These are 3 wives and a grandmother from one family of Ethiopian herders, and the only way that can be sustained is in an environment where men don't really have to do too much work and the women are almost self-sufficient because they only have one man there between the 3 of them. Whereas if you look at something like the Arctic, there aren't really any cultural rules forbidding polygyny, but it's just impossible because it's so difficult to live there that one man, women and children often have to stay indoors throughout winter. It's too cold to go out with a young baby, and therefore the man has to supply most of the food, and they just cannot, they wouldn't be able to feed 2 families. So ecological reasons, you get monogamy. And polyandry, this is one of the rarest marriage systems. So that picture is of 2 brothers married to the same woman. And it's found in areas, so this is actually pictures from Tibet, where if you notice that little green patch, that's the only farmable bit of land. The rest of that river valley is too steep, too dry, and so there's a severe shortage of land. So there's just not the option. So in order to keep the farms together, all the brothers have to marry the same woman, and the only real alternative there is to possibly, as we know, Tibet is associated with these huge monasteries, and that picture on the right, there's a monastery at the top there. All those other houses are where all the monks are living. So these are very large institutions. Something like one child in 7 is meant to go to the monastery. So, but you know, maybe they're living in somewhere where they just really couldn't sustain high rates of marriage for everybody else. So in fact, the younger brothers don't get a very good look in really in these polyamorous marriages, because they're often many years younger than their elder brother's wife that turns out to be also their wife. And if you actually inject new economies into this system, they do leave. It's not that they particularly want to be in this polyamorous marriage, but they just, the environment can't sustain anything else. Or who do you live with? So some families you live with your male relatives, your husband's relatives. Some families, some societies, you live with your wife's relatives, and these are called patrilineal and matrilineal households. So what matrilineal's always been thought of as a bit of a puzzle, because men can't really pass wealth on to their sons. They have to pass on to their sisters' sons, which everyone's sort of thought is a little bit odd. And it is rare. It's only about 17% of societies, but pops up enough places around the world that it probably requires some kind of explanation. And some of us have been using some statistical techniques to try and work out, you know, if you look at evolutionary change through time, when do you find matrilineal, when do you find patrilineal things? And we're using statistics because you can't really see those kind of social organisation in the archaeological record. So phylogeny, I'll just briefly, because we're short of time, I'll just quickly move on to this. So actually, by looking, in this case, at language similarity, languages, as populations spread out, their languages become slightly different. So we can use data on words to make these phylogenetic trees, which is what this picture is here, and we can use these to map historical migrations of people. So this is a historical migration of Bantu going through Africa. So all these languages are related. We can see which ones are more related to others, and we can use statistics that I obviously don't have time to explain in much detail now, not only to try and work out, you know, not just tips of the trees, but what was most likely to be going on sort of in the tree, so we can get a sort of little historical look at what's going on. And we did that with some African data here. I don't know if you can see, basically the red dots are patrilineal cultures and the purple dots are matrilineal cultures, and we put them on both the tree and a map there. And the Bantu started off in West Africa and it expanded through Africa. And as they sort of, basically as they moved in and out of the forest, they sort of switched between matrilineal and patrilineal social structure. And that switch occurred several times, you can see, and one of the explanations for that actually goes right down to the humble tsetse fly, in that in much of southwestern Africa, the tsetse fly prevents people keeping cattle. If you look at where there's cattle and where there's matrilineal, they don't really overlap. And so we actually can show statistically, if we map all the combinations of cattle, matrilineal, no cattle, patrilineal, which is 4 different cases, onto the tree, and do some statistics on it, we can actually look at estimated routes of cultural change in the past, and we can actually show that when matrilineal societies acquire cattle, it's not very long before they become patrilineal societies, because patrilineal wealth is often associated with polygynous marriage, as I said right at the beginning. So we've got something ecological, totally changing the sort of social structure of human society, and something as sort of, as I say, unexpected as a tsetse fly, influencing how, you know, our culture actually looks in this case. I said I'd also give some examples going the other way, where culture is influencing our sort of genetic makeup. And perhaps one of the most famous examples of that is lactose tolerance. So most of us in Europe can drink milk without any digestive problems, but actually most people in the rest of the world can't digest milk over the age of 5 because we never had any reason to. But the only populations that can have a history of keeping cattle. So this cultural innovation of keeping cattle is actually changing our own genetic makeup. So a few years ago the gene was actually identified. This is a map of the gene with the boring name of -13.9T that actually gives you the ability to digest lactose as an adult, which is very prevalent in Europe, but not very prevalent in Africa. And in fact, if you look at populations in Africa that keep livestock and compare them with populations very nearby who don't keep livestock, so in this graph, the yellow bars are the ones that keep livestock and drink milk, and the purple bars are the ones that don't. And they just don't have the ability to digest lactose. So here's a cultural trait that came in probably no more than 6,000 years ago, and in Africa probably only about 2,000 years ago. So this is really fast evolution. So it's gene culture co-evolution, changing our genes. But, it's one of the fastest ones. So here we are. You know, this is just a picture showing some very recently in our evolutionary history did we start milking cows, which is when we think this gene started to be selected for. Other examples: cannibalism. Papua New Guinea, there's a habit of eating possibly your enemies in mortuary feasts, which gives you kuru, which is a disease a bit like BSE in cows. And it puzzled epidemiologists because mainly women and children seem to be getting this disease, not men. But it turns out that only the men didn't really like eating people. They preferred to eat pigs, but there was a shortage of pigs, so the women and children ate other people and ended up giving themselves this disease. So when it was finally, and now this graph actually just shows some of the area of parts of an area where this cannibalism was common, and the pink shaded area shows where cannibalism is common, and the red dots show individuals that have this gene variant. So we've got cannibalism here, selecting for a gene variant that protects you against kuru. So another cultural trait that's changing genetic makeup. And this is another example from China. The grey bars are showing the spread of agriculture, which is associated with drinking alcohol, because once you keep grain, it ferments, and you start realizing that you can drink products of it. And the dots are showing alcohol dehydrogenase evolving there. So these are really recent cultural adaptations, long since we were hunter-gatherers, which are influencing our genetic makeup. So just think, everything, these are just ones we know about. There's others, and I'm just going back to the Tibetans where I started. We've recently found, so Tibetans live very, very high, highest long living population in the world, you know, long lived year-round over 4,000 meters, which doesn't really happen anywhere else. Tibetans have got a gene that enables them to breathe much faster than you or I would. You know, if you go up there and you try and run, you probably just fall over because you'll run out of oxygen. And Tibetans just don't have that problem, so you could almost, and there's some argument that they've only been up there really quite recently, so that's also a candidate for the fastest ever case of a genetic change through a sort of cultural tradition of living up in the mountains. So we've mainly talked about useful things. I just want to draw to your attention the possibility that cultural transmission, I think it's, you know, it's this powerful weapon that, as I said, has enabled us to take over the world, and you know, it's so useful. It is kind of what's enabling us, which is no doubt what's going to be talked on more about, to wipe out, as it were, most other species. But there is also another literature that there's quite a lot of aspects of behaviour that don't seem to make too much sense in terms of natural selection, that we think might be something to do with cultural transmission as well. And I've just given a few examples here. So religion, well, you might think it's not particularly logical behaviour, but actually, from the point of view of natural selection, it is probably, being part of a strong, cohesive group is probably quite good actually for your reproductive success. So I don't see it as too much of an evolutionary puzzle, even if it doesn't really sort of be very, not a particularly logical thing to do. Contraception might be another example that's kind of the other way round. It might be quite a logical thing to use because it makes your life easier. You don't have to be having babies all the time and worrying about all that, and you can get on with all sorts of other things. But it's probably not very good for your reproductive success at all, so we're not really very sure about what's going on there. And then you've got other things like alternative medicine, which I would contest is both not logical and not good for your reproductive success because it doesn't actually work. And there have been some models which kind of show that the less well, if you assume that we're copying others in terms of our medicinal choices, there are some scenarios where alternative medicine can actually spread more the less well it works, because if it doesn't work, people carry on taking it for longer, so they're there as a model in the population for everyone else to copy, and therefore these traditions get spread round and round. So whilst most of my talk has been about culture being a sort of very useful way of adapting to the world around us, I think we also have to keep our mind open to the possibility that because the process of cultural evolution or transmission, whatever you want to call it, is not exactly the same as the transmission of genes, we don't necessarily expect it to always take us to an end point where not just useful behaviours, but also perhaps some of these behaviours that are slightly more eccentric and harder to explain in evolutionary. Based on that, I shall pass on to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Ruth. That was marvellous, and yes, leading perfectly into Gaia's talk. Gaia will be telling us about her adventures in the Anthropocene. This term, most of you I'm sure will know, but is used by geologists to describe the times that we live in now, which are so dominated by our influence of one species on the rest of the planet. And Gaia describes it as, well, humanity has become a geophysical force on a par with the earth-shattering asteroids and planet-cloaking volcanoes that define past eras. And a couple of years ago, Gaia undertook a huge journey around the world to go and explore some of the places that are being affected very much by us and the many ways in which we're influencing the planet, and then the ways in which people are responding to those challenges. Go ahead.
Thanks, Henry. So I'll just talk a little bit about what I mean by the Anthropocene, and then I'll explain with examples of what I've seen. So ever since humans first emerged onto the wild savannah, we have been modifying our environment, as Ruth has explained, burning our way through forest, grasslands,